Hello, folks. Welcome to the second set of this part two, to finish this chapter in how do we go about maintaining and addressing our competition and driving our growth. I'm on my second pot of coffee, and I hope you are too. So I've also taken off the headset because I found that as I listened to the recording, it may not have been the best. It's interesting, at my office, I really need my headset, but here at my home, ironically, with an older machine, I don't need to, okay? Well, let's start right where we left off. We had talked about the concepts of continuous innovations, where the company is constantly innovating itself. My example, of course, to that was Samsung. We talked about dynamically continuous innovations, which is a pronounced modification in an existing product. Sometimes it's also called disruptive technologies, where you slam together two different technologies, like a cell phone and a camera, and you come up with this unique product. And then this concept is known as convergence, where these coming together of technologies to create something new. And then finally, those major ones, which are products that create a major change in the way we live. These are discontinuous innovations, and what discontinuous innovations mean is that the life you live is discontinued. You go on to something else completely different. And of course, in our lifetimes, all of us have seen a discontinuous innovations. My grandfather's, it was the automobile. In my time, it's been the microwave, it's been the internet, it's been the computer. I can go on and on. We all know the examples, okay? And so these are the things that a company, especially the market leader, can use to challenge. Now, let me also say this about innovation. Innovation is also the way that a challenger as well as a leader are able to move themselves up. I unfortunately did not have the sound on when I was talking about the Microsoft Courier and now their new tablet. But this was an opportunity for Microsoft to not only challenge but actually create an entire industry. And they didn't because they were thinking backwards. They were afraid to challenge their own market because they did not want to disrupt the operating system business that they had, which was such an enormous money maker for you. However, what happened was quite simply was that Apple and Google were able to challenge those as well by, in essence, not challenging the PC area where Microsoft was the champ. They actually changed the way we did things by using tablets versus PCs. And if you'd honestly looked at it, you would say to yourself, why didn't they consider this in the first place? And you'd be probably right as well. Microsoft had the example or the possibility of leading the way, of changing things profoundly. But they were so concerned about the share that they already had that they lacked the foresight to realize that they were going to lose something as well. There's a moral to this story, folks. There's an old saying that goes, if you're not trying to put yourself out of business, your competitors will. All right. And so it's so ironic that here we are a decade later, and Microsoft, with innovations, is going to come out with the same product. Now, having stated that, it is running Windows. So if you want to be a Microsoft defender, you can say, hey, we won the war anyway. We're going with a Microsoft operating system. However, just think of the ground that they lost as well. So it just depends on your point of view, folks. Okay, so these are the aggressive tactics that a leader can use. Innovation can also be used by a challenger. But we talked about three major strategies. We talked about that a leader wants to be able to expand the market, but they also want to to protect the market as well. Okay, and then increasing the market share is basically also about trying to take over the demand from other groups. We'll talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about now is how do businesses protect their market share and why do they do it? Marketing is not just simply offensive. It is proactive and defensive as well, and it sounds kind of strange that you may want to say that, but it's kind of true in that if you make the challengers have to work at trying to challenge you, many times they'll quite simply give it up because they don't want to challenge their own abilities as well. If you're the leader for one reason. Either you have the best products or the market, but you also probably have the deepest pockets as well. And so if you force your competition to have to work at, in essence, becoming the leader in the pack, then many times they won't. Okay, so in defensive marketing, there are actually 6 somewhat different strategies in which you can position yourself. And I use that word position, and that's the first. Position defense is basically occupying the most desirable position in a consumer's mind, and it makes the brand almost impregnable. All right? So one of those that I can think of, not for myself, but for those that are loyal, is Starbucks. Starbucks is one of those brands where consumers, a certain number of consumers, absolutely insist that that is the particular brand of coffee that they're going to have, to the exclusion of no other. That is the classic example of how strong a position defense is. It simply doesn't matter how aggressive the challengers are. Quite simply, there are those people who are unshakable of their love of Starbucks and will have nothing else. I just like a good cup of coffee. And folks, shock of all shock, I'm not offended by a fairly decent cup of coffee at McDonald's. And guess what? There's a lot of people that aren't either. Okay? So that's the first one, is the position defense. The next is what is known as the preemptive defense. And this is, in essence, it's an aggressive maneuver, especially in an industry where you attack a position first. This is a great example of the ability, if Microsoft would have come out with the Courier first, in essence, what they would have done is that they would have been aggressive before Apple was first. Other examples are price cutting, aggressive advertising, sales promotions. In other words, if your competitor, let's say they're going to come out with a very good, innovative product, and you want to be able to take the shine off of that particular momentum, one of the ways that you can do this is that you can come out with your own aggressive strategies first, and many times that will dull the attack of what they were hoping for, and they may not be able to survive. Before I preempted flanking attacks, and so let me also speak of that. And basically what those are is that if you have a particular brand or a particular product that in essence is prone or open to attack. So an example might be on this is back when Nokia was a market leader, one of the issues that Nokia had is they did not have all the solid qualities that other cell phones had at the moment. One of those things would have been to come out with a flip phone or come out with better web browsing. That would be one of those ways where they support a weak front or support a possible counterattack before it happens. Flanking is exactly what it says. It's kind of moving out on the sides of a relatively strong position to protect this certain weakness that they have in their product. Okay? The next is what's known as a counteroffensive, and this is exactly a responsive anticipation. This is where basically you have a company that is basically working or attacking you, and you attack them back. The automobile, I shouldn't say the automobile industry, but the car rental business was famous for this for years and years. You found, especially with Hertz and Avis, they were the number one and number two battlers. And Avis was always battling with Hertz, and they never really ever seemed to give up their positions, but you found that they were always constantly counteroffensing each other's commercials. It was really fascinating for quite a while. The next is mobile attacks, mobile defenses, and basically what this is that instead of slogging it out in the same basic places where you do, what you do is you try to open up new territory. And so this is when we talked about diversification. This is when you spread out into other locations or with other products that you may not have considered likely. So when Starbucks basically walled themselves in with the whole world with their own products and their own stores, what they did was they in essence branched out into the supermarkets as well. I should also say this: in 2006, 2007, Starbucks was in difficulty. Starbucks had dropped in market share in terms of selling coffee quite a bit, and one of their competitors was McDonald's, because quite simply McDonald's had a fairly decent cup of coffee. It cost at least $1 to $2 less than a Starbucks coffee, and you didn't have to wait 15 minutes in a line just to get a cup of coffee. There's a great comedian by the name of John Panette who used to say about Starbucks, I'd have to go to Dunkin' Donuts to get a cup of coffee so I could go to Starbucks and stand in line. And that's exactly it. And so what you find is that Starbucks market started to they started to lose market share, because the truth is, if you have good beans and you have the right equipment, how hard is it to make a good cup of coffee? And the answer is it's not hard at all. And instead of basically trying to constantly hammer in that direction, what they did was they mounted a mobile defense, and they reached out into other markets, such as being in supermarkets. And it was wonderfully successful for them. The last is the concept of what's known as contraction. And contraction just basically means that you can't defend the territory. You might actually find that being in that particular territory is no longer an economic possibility. And so what you might eventually see is that in order to preserve the rest of their industry, they're going to pull out of that one particular business venture. Now, sometimes the biggest difficulty with that also, and when you make a choice with a contraction, is that many times is that you'll pull out of a signature kind of industry, one in which you have made your particular mark on. When J.C. Penney decided that they were going to, in essence, be part of what would be considered a younger generation, they hired the man who helped design at Apple the iPhone. And they went through a major change in the way that J.C. Penney not only sold their clothes, but in the clothes that you could find there. Well, the problem with that is that the market share that J.C. Penney's had were women, professional women between the ages of 30 to 55, who were successful professional women, making anywhere from $60,000 to $200,000 a year. And they had a problem in that share, of course. There was the idea that this was your grandmother's place to shop. And yes, that was one of those difficulties. What I would have done, once again, is I would have rebranded a section of J.C. Penney's and gone after a younger set. But unfortunately, in the wholesale change that J.C. Penney did in their contraction away from that particular market, is that they lost the market that kept them going, and of course, they fell on hard times. I can see also, if you look at the entertainment industry, if you look at the comic book industry as well, if you look at the major IPs such as Star Trek, Star Wars, and also the Doctor Who, their contraction away from their traditional market is leaving itself wide open, especially in this time of need of losing your most loyal customers. And so contraction can be important and it can be vital, but if it removes you from your identity, the thing that made you great, then you have problems. Okay? And so these are how we go about protecting market share. The last is increasing market share, and this is where you want to be able to basically dominate the market and, in essence, take over the entire industry as well. And while this is certainly desirable, the difficulty with this is that many times the acquisition costs may far exceed the revenue value that you generate from it. If you are taking over customers, there's always the possibility that you could provoke an antitrust action. AT&T, let me think if I can remember. Yes, AT&T, I believe 5 years ago, wanted to buy T-Mobile. T-Mobile was very happy. They wanted it to go through. AT&T was happy, but the Security and Exchange Commission nixed it quite simply because they interpreted that as antitrust, and so it didn't happen. Okay? One of the difficulties also is that you might pursue the wrong activities. In other words, markets may be growing or shrinking, and quite simply you're using a significant amount of resources in order to trap or go after a dying market. And so you have to be careful that way. And then, of course, the last one is that the increased market share, the dominating or adding of that much particular in terms of your profits and sales can have an effect on quality as well. It's quite simple. If you have less time to be able to work on a given product, you have greater opportunity to make mistakes. And so sometimes increasing market share is not the best strategy. Where does this all lead to us? It leads to basically understanding that for every corporation, there's what's to be considered an optimal market share. It means that many times that as we grab market share, we grab more parts of the market, we may actually lose profitability, because as we try to expand within the market, there's always the possibility that where we expand to is simply too far beyond our own grasp. And so we have to be and accept the idea that many times growing to beyond our abilities to be able to handle that market ultimately can lead to loss. There was a great company in the 80s called Borland, and Borland made what was called a Pascal interpreter. In other words, you could program in a given language called Pascal, and you could be able to write software. It was a great little program. Borland got a great increase in market share. The individual who was the head of that corporation was a man by the name of Philip Kahn. Borland grew. They grew to the point where they actually bought WordPerfect, which was a great word processor at the time. He actually bought other corporations as well, a spreadsheet company called Quattro. He bought ultimately an entire office environment and went in direct competition with Microsoft in their office. Unfortunately, here's where the story goes bad, because quite simply they did not have the resources to be able to effect a challenge one-on-one against Microsoft, and unfortunately they went out of business. Now, fast forward into the 90s, Philippe Kahn has been spending time on the internet, very interesting work, and he decides that he understands everything about digital technology, digital audio, and digital video, and decides to see if it's possible to be able to record a video and have it shown live on the internet. Philippe Kahn is noted as the inventor of the camera phone. And so, it's hard to keep a good person down. Philippe Kahn now lives successfully, as he always has, but it just shows you the genius and invention is something that you can't take account as always being out of the game. Okay, so optimal market share. These are the discussions of market leaders. Now let's talk about market challengers. The difficulty about being a challenger is especially when it comes to competition, is deciding as the challenger, who do you attack? In essence, what is your strategic objective? Let me say that again, because that'll probably come up in a test. The market challenger must first define their strategic objective. It's usually to increase market share. So generally the challenger wants to be able to have more of the overall market. Now, having said that, they have to decide whom to attack. Do they go after the market leader and try to chip away at them, finding weaknesses? Do they look for firms their own size who perhaps may be not funded as well as you are, and that you directly attack them and they don't have the funds to keep up with you? Do you look after small local and regional firms, which certainly don't have the deep pockets, or are you happy with the status quo? Those are four questions, or four possibilities in attacking, and each one of those have to be, part of your decision process. Now, one of the things also with local and regional firms, sometimes especially if they know the regions in which they work in, quite simply, there's nothing to be gained by... Hold on, people. Okay, folks, sorry for that little pause, and we're right back in the action. So, the market challenger has basically four possibilities when he has to decide ultimately how he's going about do his business. He can, in defining his strategic objective, he can challenge the market leader. He can challenge another challenger, especially if that particular market challenger is underfunded. He can go after small and regional firms, or he can eventually just keep the status quo and stay as they are if they're happy. So, market challenger strategies are somewhat different than the market leader, because those generally are not strategies in which to defend themselves. These are generally strategies to attack. And so given the objectives and the opponents that they have, what general options do they have? Well, we're really talking about four or five different kinds of ways in which you can go after the market leader. Okay? Well, the first is basically the straight out frontal attack. And basically what this does is that you match the opponent's product, the advertisement, the price, the distribution in any way that you can. Generally in a full frontal attack, basically the problem with that is that the side with the greater resources wins. Now it's also possible as a challenger that you do have the resources, maybe perhaps even more than the leader. Because certainly it takes something out of a leader to get where they are. So that's the basics or the essence of what a frontal attack is to be able to, in essence, survive where the particular market leader is unable to be able to continue. The next is what's called a flanking attack, and a flanking attack is where you look for gaps, in essence, gaps in the leader's overall strategy, and what you try to do is be able to succeed where a frontal attack is not possible. Excuse me, folks. Let me put my light back on. I just noticed that. There I am. A flanking strategy is also a way of being able to avoid directly attacking the leader, and it's also an ability to work on weaknesses that the leader might have. Let's face it, when Microsoft owned the operating system environment, it's basically because there was one particular machine in which all technology was performed on, and that was the personal computer, whether it was a laptop or a desktop. What Apple did and what Google followed up with is basically a gap in Microsoft's planning by basically attacking the platform in which they would deliver their operating system. And so by changing the platform to a tablet, to a PC, let's also not undermine the power of what a cell phone did, and a smartphone especially, because they were the inroads for the iPad to ultimately succeed and in essence take over. They showed that there was a need there for a much more portable machine to do not only your phone calling but web browsing and those kind of things as well. The next is what's called an encirclement attack, and that's where you either have a wide swath of territory and you take a grand offensive into many different fronts. Encirclement attacks also are on a wide variety of products as well. That also is another strength in a market challenge. So instead of not just having a single product come out, you have different and multiple varieties. And in essence, what you do is you have multiple niches which allow you, in essence, to be able to attack that leader. It helps if the challenger has superior resources to be able to make all of those attacks successful at the same time. Bypassing basically means that you diversify into completely unrelated products. In essence, what you decide is that you're going to go into unique ways that your market leaders are not in, therefore bypassing them altogether. In essence, you never go into a direct attack with those particular leaders, quite simply because they may be just too powerful. And the last is guerrilla attacks, and these are usually either intermittent, unconventional ways in which you can challenge promotional blitzes, major price cuts, and one of those that Apple uses every once in a while, and that's legal action. Okay, basically your point is to harass the opponent. What you're hoping to do is to keep them off balance and basically never give them firm ground in which they can be success. Usually it's backed by a stronger attack to hopefully beat the opponent. Okay? So these are market challenger strategies. Now, we can also be what is considered to be a market follower, and that is a corporation or a company in an industry which quite simply realistically understands that it could never be a leader, and it can really maybe not even be a challenger. It basically, innovation costs money. Okay, and so whether you're a challenger or whether a leader, what it means is you have the resources necessary in research and development to be able to go out there and command not only a sufficient amount of the market, but enough research and development to change the industry. And so what this means is that you have three ways in which you can try to play off the market. So the first is you can be a cloner. Okay, and so what the cloner does is they emulate the leader's package. Okay, so you emulate the leader's products, you emulate the leader's names, the packaging. If we go into before Sam's Choice was Sam's Choice, you would find often that their particular drinks looked very similar to a Coke. And the reason why is quite simply is that the looks and the characteristics were similar enough that, especially if you use what are called information cues, such as colors and fonts, that you very well might likely pick up that can versus picking up a Coca-Cola. In the tablet market, any of you have seen that there are tablets under $40. What I mean is like not just a Samsung or an iPad, but brands such as RCA, any of those particular items, that they're $50 or $60. And what they do in essence is they clone similar characteristics, the screen size, the buttons on them. Perhaps they have a place to put in a SIP card. You have what are considered to be most of the characteristics, but unique enough. Those certainly are not leaders, but they're going to be, in essence, close enough so that they'll be able to pick up a piece of the market just because they're able to command individuals who buy it simply for price. I got into this idea one time to try this, and I found that most of these are fairly decent products. The big difference is, of course, between an iPad and some of these lesser tablets, quite simply, is the resolution on the screens. I mean, some of them, they just simply can't match it, okay? The imitator is basically a company that copies some of the things from the leader, but differentiates in such a way, in such a substantial way, that the leader does not out and aggressively attack them, or in essence they could be challenged for legal reasons in one way or another. And so they do stamp out somewhat of their own ground, but not exactly what you would say exactly like that. So when the PCs came out, when IBM kind of blessed the computer industry with coming out with the PC, there were a lot of manufacturers that came out with imitations. And so these were companies like Columbia Data Products. In essence, they did the same things, but they did not use the same drives, not the same video cards, and they were close enough, especially with the PC DOS or the MS-DOS operating system, so that they could be considered to be reasonable alternatives. Okay. The last is the adapters, and the adapters are on much different ground because the adapters take what is considered to be the existing technology or the existing way, and what they do is they focus on making it better. And so the adapters are granted their particular market follower status because what they have is a unique and distinct product that in some ways could even be better than the original. When Compaq came out, when the PCs were originally out, the IBM PC used the Intel 8088 processor. The Intel 8088 processor thought in 16 bits, but the input and output was 8 bits. And by that what I meant is that the inputs from the video from the keyboard, those kind of things, they were input in an 8-bit way, and they were output in an 8-bit way. And so while the CPU processed at 16 bits, the output, such as the video, was only in 8-bit. And that's why you saw if you ever see the 8-bit kind of video, you've got an idea of why they were clunky in their time. Compaq came along. They took the very same unit. They did an imitation of the PC, but instead of using the 8088 processor, they used the 8086 processor. The 8086 processor was superior because it input and output at 16 bits along with processing at 16 bits as well. It meant that they functioned around 30 to 35% faster. And so that was one of their very unique characteristics. It also brought an entire industry that basically would do what's called overclocking. And so you would take the unit where it would process at 4.77 megahertz and you'd amp it up to 8 megahertz. We got into the 80286s and the 80386s, the 486s, and they would take those units and double and triple the processing speed on those units. And so that's what adapters would do. They would take what you have and make it faster. The last group is what are known as market nichers, and those are to be leaders in a small market, or basically they, in essence, take their small sliver of the market that they're very happy with, and they're willing over time to be successful in that particular way. These are firms usually with low shares of the total market, but they're very profitable in the area that they're happiest with. And so in Louisiana enjoys a good cup of coffee along with everyone else, but instead of the nationwide leaders such as Maxwell House and those, they use their coffee is done by a company called Community. There was also another one known as Mellow Joy. These are, once again, very narrow markets in a big market, but they control that particular market when it comes to Southwest Louisiana. Now, it's interesting. You can find Community on the shelves at the Walmarts here in Boone. They've, in essence, become a nationwide distributor. And that's one of the other things that we can say about niche strategies is that sometimes they can be sizable enough in their own rights. And so market specialists, especially when they are superior in their particular strata, they become popular and successful because they, in essence, control their particular share of the market. Now, I'm going to stop right here, and we will do a third part of this, and we're going to talk about the product life cycle and how that relates to competition and how we consider all of those things together and how do we go about considering market innovations and strategies based upon the life cycle of a given industry. Okay? So I will be back with part 3.